Good morning, everyone. I'm glad there's a number of you here. So I wasn't here on Wednesday for the ebooks presentation, and I've heard a lot about ghosts and gunshots and general excitement. And I'm not promising any of that this morning, but if it happens, I shall power through. Probably not as elegantly as Hugh and I believe Karen did the other day. So we're here this morning to hear about the future of research. We have some early career researchers with us. There's an overlap, obviously, with, we could call them students. Some of them are, or maybe all of them are lecturing or tutoring as well. So really what we've got here are the people that use the stuff that we create. So this is your chance to hear what they do in their day-to-day lives. Hopefully think of some questions you can ask them. We have a few already lined up, but really hear from the horse's mouth what it's all about. We have medicine, science and social sciences represented. We did have a humanities speaker, but she had to pull out, unfortunately, at the last minute. But I think we've probably got plenty to be going on with and thinking about. So let me just talk a little bit about myself. So I am Bernie Folan. Until very recently, I was in marketing at Sage Publications in London. I have been increasingly passionate about customer needs and understanding customer experience. And to do that, asking the right questions and making sure we listen to the answers and then decide what to do with that information. So I was very pleased to be asked to do this morning. I'm about to begin studying for a market research qualification so I can learn how to do it properly and learn how to ask the right questions in the right way and then figure out what to do with the information. So I'll move on. I've just got 4 slides and then I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, our first researcher speaker. But this session is called Future of Research, Discovering What Your Readers Expect Now and in the Future, or Tell Publishers What You Need. So that's a message to the guys up here on the panel. And moving on, so as I've explained, these are early career researchers / students / tutorers. But I need to just talk about these terms very quickly. Born digital, digital native. I'm going to show them now and then they're going to disappear and we're not going to mention them again because they're rather contentious terms. And I think actually what we need to think about is just helping the people that we aim to help do their work well and not worry too much about terminology. And probably we should be over saying digital now in the same way soon we probably won't call smartphones, they'll be mobiles. I think, everybody's using digital, we're all doing different things. There's been research to show that actually whether you're a digital native or immigrant, you may use technology more or less, and there isn't this, binary age divide that means that people born after 1980 do things dramatically differently. They may do, and we may hear some of that today, but let's not get too hung up on the terminology is all I wanted to say there. So we've heard a lot actually, thankfully, really, in the last 2 days about our customers. And we've talked about the skills needed in publishing. We've talked about whether we understand enough about our customers. And I think it's important that we challenge our assumptions on a regular basis and really hear how research is being done today and will be done in the future. And this is, as I said before, your chance to ask the questions you may have and take some information back with you and maybe ask some more questions when you get back. But I just wanted to say something about whether we are asking those questions, because I think when we all gather together, it's very easy for us to say the right things, and we all know what we should be doing. But building that into our everyday working lives is something different. And the reason I've asked, is there really only one question? Because I wanted to just give an example of how, or a couple of examples of how, that demonstrate, I think, that we don't always build into our everyday lives the stuff that we all know we should be doing. So I was very struck that at the UKSG conference earlier this year, we had a speaker, a medic speaking at that conference, and there was a real energy after his talk, and everybody was kind of buzzing and saying, wasn't it amazing to hear how his work's been done, and, I didn't realise there was such issues with ebooks, and different questions were coming up. And I was quite struck that even though, and there were a lot of librarians at that conference, obviously, and both the publisher and the librarian audiences were all kind of buzzing with hearing, firsthand how his research was being done. And it kind of dismayed me quite a bit, because we work in universities, or we're regularly visiting universities to do business, and it should be that we're having those conversations on a regular basis and building them into how we work. And I just felt that clearly there was a gap there. And then another example I have is that I was speaking to a publisher about a session they were organising at the publisher office, and he was telling me that he was organising a panel of researchers a bit like this today at the office, and asked to gather questions from the staff across the departments, and he asked over 300 people if they had a question for the researchers, and he received one response. And that was including editorial, production, marketing, sales, senior management people. And I think that speaks volumes, really, because either people weren't curious or they were too busy to be curious. But I think either way, that's a real worry. So, moving on, I just thought I'd give us a couple of examples of the sorts of questions that, we should be asking on a regular basis. And I thought of most of these myself quite quickly, so it can be done. And the point really is to make interacting with our customers. And I know not everybody likes that word, but I think let's face it, that's what we're in business. We're in business to, fulfill our mission, but we also need to, make the business work. And we do have customers that we need to serve. So we should really be asking on a regular basis questions like these that are coming up here. What do you love? What do you hate? Who do you think we compete with? So we may have our own sense of our competitors, but as we heard actually from some of the people on the panel yesterday talking about what a publisher is, there are other players we all know coming into our space: Google, Amazon, so on and so forth. So who do our customers think our competitors are, and do they match who we believe they are? What does your typical day look like? How would you measure the value we provide? So what makes us what makes our content something that you must have? What device do you read email on? What device do you surf on? Then a question for the publishers: who needs our content but can't get it? Does everybody know that? There is evidence that can be found to demonstrate that. What happens if our users can't get what they need? What are the steps? What's the process? How long before they move on to the next publisher's content? Do we really know which departments and which levels are using our content? I know that when I've spoken to librarians, there's a will often to know more demographic information about users, but the time or the machinery isn't there to find that out. And I think we make assumptions about what usage is, but we should really know more about who the users are. So really, that's just a few examples of how we should be interacting with customers a habit and asking questions like these and more whenever we get the chance. And then just very quickly, I wanted to just kind of demonstrate something. I put this slide in yesterday at the last minute after listening to Victor Henning talk, actually, at a session yesterday. And he made a kind of quite a provocative, I suppose, statement, but I thought there was a lot of truth in it. And that's that we are still a copyright-led business, and we lock content away for reasons we all understand. We can't just have everybody accessing everything. We need to run our businesses. But he did make the point that we should be making life convenient in the same way that the music business was disrupted. It's easy to find whatever song you want at any place, any time now. It's very convenient. We still have things locked away. And I know for myself, I was looking for some information last year, and this is just a screenshot of one, and many of them are the same. One of the horrible screens that people are confronted with and this was actually after I'd said I wanted to pay-per-view, so this wasn't me. This was after I'd clicked that button, so I was ready to spend some money. And I got as far as putting my email address in and then thought, really, life's too short, I can't bear it, and went onto Twitter and used the hashtag #IHasPDF and got what I needed quite quickly. But it just struck me listening to Victor yesterday that why don't we all have PayPal? Why aren't we making it easier for people to get what they need quickly? People will spend money. We should be thinking of ways around locking it away. It's just life's too short. And then I was talking to my son, who's 11, before I came here, because I thought, well, he's a future researcher. And then I realised that he's a researcher now. So what he's researching is how to progress in levels in games like Minecraft or Sonic Generations. So this is a kind of what he's doing, and this is a forum where people are asking some questions about how to move further. And I asked him what his biggest gripes, what are his problems when he's trying to find information on the web. And he said, I need to get more precise research results. It shouldn't take longer than a minute. It takes too long. I'm sick and tired of trying to look through lots of information to find the piece I need. And I thought, well, that's exactly the same as what I hear from lots of librarians and lecturers about how undergrads increasingly are searching. You know, they put a term into Google, not a precise term necessarily for what they want to find, and have a very short attention span and want to move on and get what they need quickly. So it's happening, and the user is not broken. That's what's happening out there. So I think we just need to be thinking about ways around locking things away and making it hard. Okay, so finally, I just pulled out some words from various mission statements of the publishers that are here or beyond. The red is my emphasis. And let's just remember that we do all have a mission to fulfill, and we make rather grand claims. So let's be aware of whether our practice matches what we say we want to do. You know, there are some grand world-class advancing knowledge, improving lives, improving productivity and outcomes of those we serve, and making genuine contributions. So I think we do need to be mindful of those mission statements, as well as doing good business and making sure our businesses thrive and move forward. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker. Sabina is going to speak first. Sabina is going to tell you a bit more about herself, so I'll just give a very brief introduction. Sabina is an environmental scientist who is exploring the effect of volcanic and aeolian dusts on respiratory health. So I think you're going to say a bit more about your work, so I'll leave it there and move on to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm doing a PhD at Durham University. I'm in the really awful writing up stage at the moment. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my work and what I do. And then the second half of the talk is going to be about a kind of like a wish list of interactions with publishers. And the second half is kind of informed a bit by the first half, so by what I do, but also I've spoken to my fellow PhD students and postdocs in my department, and also with members of Sense About Science. So I'm kind of representing the views of the Voice of Young Science here today as well. As Bernie said, I'm an environmental scientist, and the research that I do is quite interdisciplinary, which brings its own particular set of challenges. I have a slightly different perspective because between my first and second degrees, I worked in industry at the Conventions and Policy section in Kew Gardens. So I researched plants threatened by trade, and there was a lot of legal stuff involved with that. Okay, so what do I do? Well, I look at quarry dusts. We know that quarrying certain types of rocks, such as coal and asbestiform minerals, is bad for lung health. No one's looked specifically in detail before at volcanic rocks, although we do know that volcanic ash can cause a potential respiratory hazard. So my project is a kind of compare and contrast to see whether dust from volcanic quarried deposits are a similar hazard to ash. Okay, so this is a little bit about how I do my work. The colours haven't come up very well, but there's three sort of broad categories. So the first four are characterization. So this is the geological side of things. Then the next section is chemistry and toxicology, so kind of chemical and biological. And then finally, there's a bit of social sciences. And on the right-hand side, I've just put the kind of the techniques and the instruments that I might use for these different parameters. And the important thing, I guess, to say for this is that a lot of these instruments are very scattered. So a couple of them are at Durham, but I also regularly travel to Edinburgh, Cardiff, London, Cambridge, and Turin in northern Italy to do experimental work. So spend a lot of time on planes and trains. So it's really good to have either a laptop or a notebook, tablet, something like that I can do work on, look things up, double check the techniques, or perhaps download a user's manual for the instrument that I'm going to be using so that I can be sure that I'm kind of aware of all the parameters, because there's an extra pressure when you're working away from your own department, the time that the technicians can give you, and you kind of try and get as much understanding before you get there. Okay. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why I do what I do, because in the second half of the talk, there are some of my ideas for how to make my life easier, but perhaps you might have some of your own. So this is kind of a brief guide as to why. So in terms of the characterization, we look at the grain size of the dust, so we can see how deeply it can penetrate the lungs, because anything that's too coarse won't be a hazard because it won't enter the respiratory system. We look at the type of magma that came out of the volcano, because different magma types will have different mineralogical assemblages, and there are different minerals of health concern to look at. One of those minerals is crystalline silica, which is commonly known as quartz. It's implicated in several diseases, silicosis, it's a carcinogen, and there can be associated TB with that. And we look at the morphology or the shape of the particles. Some particles, such as the asbestiform fibres, are very difficult to clear from the lungs, so the actual shape is quite important too. Then moving on to the chemical and toxicological areas, I look at surface area, which is perhaps more of a physical parameter, but we normalise all our chemical and biological data for the surface area of the particle, so I've put it in with those. And I look at production of free radicals, the reactivity of ion species on the surface of the particle, both drivers in inflammation and carcinogenic factors. And I also do some toxicology experiments. These are done chemically, where we replicate a reaction that happens with cell membranes, and they're done biologically on red blood cells. So in many ways, this is the theoretical reasons why a particle might be toxic, and these are the actual ways of measuring the real results, and the ideal scenario is when these match up with those. And then finally, because I'm dealing with people in a real-world situation, I look at the actual levels of dust that they're exposed to in the quarry. So, for example, is one part of the quarry dustier than another? Are there certain operations that put workers at a particular risk? And then I talk to the managers. I have kind of semi-structured interviews and questionnaires where I find out what measures they take to prevent dust hazard in their quarry, and I talk to the workers to see if they perceive whether there's a risk or not, because ultimately whether they wear a mask or not isn't dependent on how toxic the dust is, but it's more dependent on whether they perceive there to be a risk. So one of the main challenges has been trying to get information from across disciplines, and to try and make all that match up for me. Okay, so these are the kind of points that we came up with for publishing. So we would like the publishing industry and associated industries to empower us as researchers. And to do that, we would like to share our work pre-publication. So the points I've put here are to have a data repository. At the moment, if I want to share data with colleagues in the US or in just even outside my own department, I have to put my data somewhere they can see it. So it can't go on email because it's too big. Often we'll use Dropbox, and someone mentioned the Amazon Cloud yesterday. In terms of the free spaces, once you get to a certain limit, you have to start paying. So we thought actually what would be really neat is if we already know we want to write a paper with a particular publisher, if we could have space to share our data on there. And that leads to the second point, which is the interface for real-time editing. So at the moment, commonly now what I would do is write a paper in Word, send it to a co-author, they'd put their changes in and track changes, send it back. Or we'd try and do it as real-time as possible using something like Google Docs. But if there was an interface on the publisher's website where we could do this and everybody could see it at the same time, then that would be fantastic. Many of the points that we came up with are things that basically make the whole process faster and more streamlined. So, for example, producing diagrams. If we come up with a graph to check our data, then we'll probably polish it up for a talk or for a poster, but it'll take a long time to reformat it to a particular publisher's specification. So any kind of easy diagram production would be good. And I've got auto-scaling in there as an example. So these are microscopy shots of particulate, and this one I think is 10 microns and that one is 5 microns. And if I wanted to make a composite image of say 12 different pictures and I wanted the same scale bar, it would take me quite a long time in Photoshop or something to try and scale all those. So some kind of auto-scaling would be a fantastic feature for that. And we also felt a little bit that peer review is kind of set up towards whatever the current common theory is or the current accepted theory on a particular subject. And if you have something that's a little bit different or very different and innovative, then often you're already at a disadvantage before it's even gone through the peer review process. So I guess a peer review process that's more open to innovative ideas would be good. In terms of empowering us to share our work after it's published, a social networking button. So when you get the little email that says, your paper's now online here, it would be great, like when you buy a box set on Amazon that says, do you want to tell your friends you've just bought this box set? And then you can click Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. It would be quite nice to tell all your contacts on LinkedIn that you've just published this paper because they might want to read it. They work in the same area as you. And that kind of generates extra publicity and extra traffic to your paper. The other thing we came up with was when you, so people have these citation alerts, but if not everyone has them or not everyone follows up on them, when you submit your paper and it's approved for publication, if there was a little checkbox next to all the authors in your bibliography and you could tick the ones that you thought would be really interested in the paper, and then they get an email with the abstract and a link maybe to the paper, that would be quite nice for them. Costs. Now, this has been discussed quite a lot over the past couple of days, and we're aware that there are changes afoot in how paper is going to be funded. But we felt that kind of the structured pricing where junior academics or small consultancies had reduced rates would be quite favourable. In my own case, I work in a research group where there are only 3 people compared to, for example, the guys and girls that work on petroleum. There's about 30 of them. And so the amount of journals available to me is quite a lot less. I'm the only person who works on quarrying in my department, so I often find that if I can't get the journal and there isn't a loan version so I can kind of see whether the paper's going to be good or not, I'll write to the person who wrote it and say, please, can you send me your paper? Sometimes we can get an interlibrary loan, which costs a couple of pounds. We get a link from the British Library, and you can access that link for a week, and you can print off that paper once, which is quite handy because you can't always tell from the abstract how useful it's going to be. The same with small consultancies. Some of my friends have done postdocs and then gone to work in industry, and they just can't afford the journal subscriptions and find it very difficult to keep up to date with new advances that they could implement in their technology. And finally, peer review incentives. We know that some journals offer incentives to reviewers, and we thought that was quite a good idea because peer review often comes quite low on the list of things that we need to do because it's not something that's either paid, that we get direct money for, or funding, or it's not looked at in the ref. And so even if it was something like if you send us a good quality review in a timely fashion, then the publisher will offer us 1 free illustration for our next paper, something like that. We're much more likely to commit to that. The other thing we came up with was the kind of teach us angle. So talking to people from different institutions at the Sense About Science workshop, it turned out that the amount of training offered to researchers is highly variable, and very few people get any training in things like peer review or how to write a paper. So it's the onus is on us to look at the different websites of the different publishers, find the information. Often it's not streamlined, so you don't really know where to look, or there's a publishing company that has a few different journals, and each journal has a slightly different way of doing things, and that all takes time. So it'd be quite nice if there was a kind of more guidance or kind of checklists for submitting what you need to do and why you need to do it. We had a discussion about cover letters, so we came up with the idea that the main point of a cover letter was to explain to the editor how your work fitted into the wider discipline, but we weren't really sure how important the cover letter was. If the cover letter is not brilliantly written, will they not look at the paper? Same with the actual paper itself. How long should the sections be? Often we'll download lots of papers in a similar style to the one we want to write, and then try and work out how much weighting is given to the introduction, or how the methodologies are presented. So in a way, it would be quite useful to have samples or guidance or templates in that respect. So that was one of the kind of the teacher's bits, and the other one was we'd like to know more about what we should be reading, and we'd like better search results. So, for example, my department favours Web of Knowledge for searching for papers. And you log in with your institutional login, you do your search, you click on the papers you want, but often they're not the most relevant papers. So what we tend to do is go to Google Scholar and do a search there where we get much more relevant papers, then pick out the ones that are really, really good and search for those specifically in Web of Knowledge. Because unfortunately, Google Scholar doesn't let you export citations, it doesn't link to the PDF of the final article, so Web of Knowledge does that because I've already logged in with my institutional login. If my institution has a subscription, it's just a one-button click to the paper. And when we're sent suggestions of what kind of, you like this paper, maybe you'll like these papers, sometimes it's quite a convoluted process to actually then get to that paper. And often it's a paper that's suggested because it's also published by that journal. It might not necessarily be the most relevant paper to the one you've just downloaded, but it came from the same publisher. So I guess smarter algorithms would help with that. And then just to sum up, we were quite chuffed to be asked to share our views, and now that researchers can submit from their laptop straight to the publisher's website and it doesn't have to go through a departmental hierarchy, it's nice that that gap's sort of been closed. And so I just wanted to say on behalf of the research community that we're quite happy and eager to talk to you. And the things that we particularly liked that publishers were doing were the loan papers I mentioned. You can kind of get it for a week, see if it's useful. The journals that had short turnaround times for things like reviewing and publication. And if a paper's been rejected because it's too long, or it's not been formatted correctly, or there's something that's going to take a little bit of effort to put right, but the paper's subject matter is still relevant to the journal, then it's great to receive encouragement for resubmission where that's valid. Because if you've had a paper rejected, it's nice to know whether you should try again, or whether you should maybe take it somewhere else, or maybe have a rethink about how you've structured the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. We're taking questions at the end, so unless anybody has something that they really feel the need to understand right now, please hold on to your questions to the end. I know there's going to be quite a bit of information before that stage, but if you just jot them down or tweet them with the ALPS hashtag ALPS13, then we'll get back to you. We should have at least 15 minutes or 20 minutes maybe for questions at the end, possibly. Okay, so we're going to move on to Tom Lewis. Tom is a final year medical student from the University of Warwick, who previously graduated from the University of Durham in physics with first-class honours. He's going to carry on telling you a bit more about himself and how he works. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Tom, and I'm going to talk to you today about what it's like from a medical student perspective. So, a little bit about me. I'm a final year graduate entry medical student at the University of Warwick. I previously did a physics degree at the University of Durham. I'm also an editor for imedicalapps.com, which is a website which reviews mobile apps for healthcare purposes. And I'm very keen to follow an academic medical career as opposed to a clinical medical career. So here's what I'm going to talk about. My average research diary, what I kind of do on a day-to-day basis. What are some of the issues that I face as a junior researcher? What do I think needs to change? Where I think we should go from here, and then what I perceive as some of the challenges facing publishers, and then a little summary. So, how do I spend my day? Well, as a final year medical student, I actually spend 9 to 5, and if not longer, in hospital every day. I'm currently on my acute block, and so what it means in terms of my researching is that I actually have to do my research, if you like, in my spare time, kind of in the evenings, on my odd half days off, at the weekends. But it also means that I work across a variety of sites. So sometimes I'm at hospitals, I'm at various NHS trusts, I'm sometimes at the university, and I'm often at home as well. And the kind of projects that I do, as you can see there, are systematic reviews, case reports, review articles, and the area of research that I'm interested in and currently following up is in the impact of mobile apps on healthcare. And I don't know how many of you have been to hospital recently, but often you'll see doctors kind of wandering around with tablets or smartphones, and it's that kind of new developments that I'm looking into to see how that can improve healthcare. Now, being a medical student and being across multiple trusts means that mobile access is absolutely essential for me, and that's something which I'm going to come and touch on a bit later. But how do I actually access the content that you guys are providing? Well, PubMed, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may not, is a central repository database which contains at least the abstracts of all the articles which have ever been published in medicine. And this is where I find the majority of things that I want to read, but I access them via a number of areas. So sometimes my colleagues email them to me, sometimes I have them sent to me via Dropbox links. Social media is probably the central core area where I find out and read about most of this stuff, things like Twitter and Facebook. I spend a reasonable amount of time searching individual journal websites, looking at the latest issues, and I also have an RSS feed set up which pulls all the articles from probably about 30 or 40 journals, and that just goes direct to my email. And then the core hub for me is Mendeley. Now, I know there's a range of reference manager options, but I like Mendeley because it's free. And also, it syncs with the cloud, so I can access Mendeley on my iPhone, on my tablet, on my computer. I can access it just by logging in. And I'm not joking when I say that all my research that I've done, everything, all my data is on this device right here. And I can access any paper that I've got anywhere at any time using this. So it's incredibly important to me to have access to my data anywhere. I just want to point something out which means that why my talk might be slightly different to the others, which is the fact that the content which is being produced in medical journals actually has a secondary impact other than just advancing medical knowledge. And that's because we actually use the decisions and research found to impact on clinical decisions. So this is what we call evidence-based medicine, which, as you can read there, is the conscientious and explicit and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. So the fact that we can't access a paper or something has implications not just because we can't read about it, but also we may not be able to give the best care to our patients. And then whenever you start talking about that, medics tend to get quite twitchy. So what do I think are some of the current issues? Well, I've broken them down into 4 issues here which affect me as a medical student and junior researcher. Primarily is information overload. On average, there's 1 new article added to PubMed every single minute. I will talk more about each of these in detail, but as you can see there, that's a huge amount of information and far more than any single person can process at any one time. Secondly, which kind of goes hand in hand, is how do we assess the quality of this research? How do we know that what we're reading is not utter tripe, for example? Thirdly is kind of the open access argument, difficulty accessing articles, and I'll talk about more about that later. And then finally, because of the way that medical careers are structured, in particular academic medical careers, it's becoming more and more important to measure the individual impact of a single author rather than just a research team or anything like that. So that's something that I think publishers can consider working on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about each of these areas, what the problems are, and then how I think one way that it could be solved. So in terms of information overload, there's this flood of medical knowledge, and although tools have been introduced to try and help us identify key information, things like PubMed was introduced for this purpose, and some of the other databases, they're fairly unwieldy and not precise enough. As we heard before, these databases, to put a decent search in can take you up to 40 minutes of just inputting search terms, and even then you might still generate 3,000 results, which you then have to go through. The availability of new knowledge in medicine is completely overwhelming at the moment, and it's very, very difficult to identify what is the key areas that, the key articles that are relevant to you. And I think this is obviously going to impact on you guys as publishers, because if we can't find the content you guys are producing, then it's not very helpful to us. And so I wondered, is there a new approach that we need to adopt or certainly look at? In terms of assessing the quality of content, this is generally regarded to be quite difficult. I think that impact factor is relatively outdated. I think there's so many other ways that you can assess the quality of a journal, of an article, just other than just how many times it's been cited, in particular because it takes so long for citations to actually come through. And as you can see, there's a little kind of tongue-in-cheek joke at impact factor here, but I think that we do need alternatives. We do need ways to critique papers, ways to communicate with the authors, ways to talk about what are the problems with a particular paper, almost like a journal club. And I also think we need to be able to critique and endorse papers on an almost real-time basis. And of course, this then comes back to the measuring the individual research impact. Now, I'm not an expert on open access by any stretch, and so I can only tell you how it affects me, and there's two issues that I just like to raise with you guys. The firstly is that it is incredibly frustrating when you are desperate to read a paper and you have no way of getting access to it, either through an institution login or through Athens. As all members of the NHS actually get a fairly decent Athens subscription, so they can access a large number of medical journals, but when you can't access them, then if it's not included in that, then it's very, very frustrating. And the thing is, you don't need it during 9 to 5. That never happens. It's always at the middle of the night, or when you can't just ask your librarian if you can get it, or and if you don't have, which leads into my second point, is just, you can't necessarily just pay for it. As a junior medical student researcher, I don't have a team. I'm not part of a research team with a formal supervisor or funding. There's no grants that support me. So even if I want to try and pay even something like $30 or 30 quid to access an article, that would be coming out of my pocket. And I can assure you that as a medical student, that there's not much money in there at all. So the final problem is how to measure individual impact. And this is increasingly essential because people are looking at what are you doing as an individual for things like grants. They want to know the impact of you in your field and not just your research team, because they want to make sure that you and the work you're doing is actually making a positive impact on the medical knowledge available. H-index, which I'm sure you've all heard of, is pretty good, but I think, again, it's limited because it's based on citations. And even though I've published a number of articles this year, it might be a year or two before these even get cited. And then there's just a long lead time on that. And given the fact that I'll be applying for an academic career in 3 years' time, conceivably, my H-index, just like every other medical student who's engaged in research, will probably be 0. So I think that it's something that could be worked on. Similarly, the lack of a central researcher registry and the rise of services like OrcID, which are quite good for kind of demonstrating what you as an individual have done, but these are only just starting up. So those are some of the problems, and what needs to change? Well, I think that obviously the internet fundamentally changed how the publishing industry works, and it's still kind of working out, particularly as we move towards Web 2.0. But I think that this is one area which could make a real difference and solve a lot of these problems that I've talked about. And so I'd like to just kind of show you my perception, certainly from a medical student, how it would help. So how could we solve information overload with like Web 2.0 stuff? Well, things like algorithms, paginators, filtering, digital curation would all make it easier to identify the articles that would be most relevant to me. things like content aggregators, and these are all technological solutions which we could implement. I think this is why Google Scholar is becoming so popular, because it is identifying what the articles that we want to read. But then there's another aspect to it, which is kind of the human aspect, which is making sure that we are looking in the right places for articles, making sure that we're choosing appropriately, and then making sure that we're regularly reflecting on our methods of kind of sorting through all the papers to try and identify which is useful. And one of the things that I do, why social media is so useful, is because I can follow on Twitter the key leaders in any particular field, and then I just read what they tweet. So they put up links to articles, and I'll just go and read those ones and download them into my Mendeley, and it's brilliant for keeping track of what's up to date. How can we assess the quality of the content? I recently attended an event called the BMJ Hack Day, which was a hackathon designed to try and see if we can make the BMJ, using BMJ resources to make it better. And one of the ideas which really caught my eye was, how can you make reading journal articles better? So rather than having a PDF, how can you work out how good it is? And this was what they came up with. So this isn't my idea at all, but you can read more about that online. But what they've done here is they've taken a PDF and then they've just added all the statistics to it. So you can see things like, you've obviously got your title, you can see the download frequency, you can see its citations, which is currently pretty much all that's recorded, how many people have viewed it, where it's ranked within the journal. And then what I really liked was this. They had people commenting on various sections, like in the methodology, saying, do you think your sample size was too small? Do you think there was any problems? And can you imagine if you had something like this just for every article? You could just click it, and then you wouldn't need any kind of critical appraisal skills. You could just read this and get a feel for kind of how good, in inverted commas, the article actually is. And then over here, I quite liked, you could endorse it, or you could almost like a like button. But I just thought this was a really nice approach. It's all hypothetical, but it's just one example of what could be. Now, in terms of open access, the problems there were the fact that not having any kind of funding or grants meant that accessing articles was difficult, but also submitting articles. I know that the rise of most journals that you submit to are free, but some of the ones that you are leaders in the field that I research in are open access only, which means that you have to pay £2,000 to £3,000 if your article is accepted. And I've definitely chosen not to submit articles to those leading journals because of the fact that I would have no way of paying. So what I would propose would be a student, if you like, a student rate. If you go to any academic conference, they'll have the normal delegate rate, but then they'll normally have a student rate. And I don't understand why you couldn't apply that to open access journals as well. For example, rather than paying £2,000 or £3,000 to submit an article, why not, if you're the first author as a student, and can prove it obviously, why not make it kind of £200 or £300? I don't think, and you need to look at the numbers, but I don't think that would have too much of an impact on the actual finances. But I just think it would be a nice idea. And there's also something from the BMJ hack called the open access button, which again you might like to look into, which just shows a map on the world about how many times people have been denied access to articles because of the fact that there's paywalls. I pulled this off the other day, and you can see that this is a worldwide problem where people can't access articles. How could we measure individual impact? I think maybe looking into altmetrics. I hear the guys unfortunately didn't win an award last night for their altmetrics journal, but something like this could be very interesting, looking at social media just to see how you could improve the impact that individuals are having. So where do we go from here? Well, I think I've highlighted lots of areas which could be done, but I think the most exciting, and I might be a little bit biased because it's what I research in, but is mobile technology. And this is because it's portable, it's reliable and dynamic. I've seen plenty of people here with tablets and smartphones, but I think the key thing is that knowledge becomes accessible independent of location. And medics are recognizing this. The use of mobile devices by clinicians and researchers is increasing rapidly, and many are using these devices to access articles and other research at the point of care, at the bedside, which is something that we've never been able to do before in any kind of traditional or kind of modern publishing sense. So how can publishers embrace mobile? Well, currently there's two options. There's mobile-friendly websites, and and then there's mobile journal apps. And I think both options are generally, at the moment, currently fairly limited in scope and utility. I'd just like to do a straw poll. How many of you guys have actually spent a bit of time going through the mobile version of your journal website, if it's applicable? So a reasonable number of you. I would argue that, just to go and try it and see what it's like if you have to spend more than 5 minutes on it. And I think you'll find that you just get quite frustrated that it's not very easy to use. But mobile offers such a number of advantages over traditional models. This is from the BMJ, who have got their journal app, and it's actually really good. It's one of the, probably the top medical journals, not obviously in terms of its impact factor, but from a mobile perspective. And that's because they've got things like all the articles will be here. They've got other media, such as blogs and news and videos. They've got the ability to share articles on social media, to really disseminate knowledge. And then what I really like, which is really simple, you can just tap on one of these names and you'll get a little email box that will just come straight up to the author. I mean, if you've got a question that you're reading, you're like, oh, hold on. You can just tap it and send it, a 2-line email in 10 seconds. Whereas, if you wanted to do that with a regular journal that just has a PDF, then you've got to search through, find the email address, fire up your email client, and it's not very easy at all. So I think that things like this are a great way forward. However, there are other challenges facing publishers, and I think that the big one is probably medics are now using alternative sources of information to get their content. So this is things like the rise of the content aggregator app, and if you're not sure what that is, I've got a little demo. The rise of social media, things like FOMED and Twitter. People are using podcasts and blogs and RSS feeds. And what this is doing to publishers, which you probably know more than I do, but I think it draws content away from all the articles. It only highlights certain articles from a journal and therefore reduce the kind of traffic. So the reason I think content aggregator apps are particularly interesting is because these use technology to pull all the articles that you want to read into one place. And it's almost like these are filling a space, which I think publishers should be filling. So you can see here that you can select an area. It pulls up like the latest clinical trials. It pulls up information and articles from leading journals. It's got videos. And then another example is this, which kind of allows you to sign up for the journals you want to follow. And then these, the app itself has an algorithm which determines what you may or may not want to read. You can sign up for specialties. You can sign up for, and when you've put in all your data, including your institutional login, it starts providing papers for you to read. And these are, full papers. You can get the abstract, and then you just tap it, and it'll automatically download if your institution login can access it. And then you can import this straight into your reference manager of choice. So I think that's particularly interesting. And the final thing I'd like to talk about is FOMED, which I'm not sure how many of you have ever heard of, but it's FOAM, if you like, stands for Free Open Access Education, and FOMED is the Twitter hashtag. And I'll just read this out here. If you want to know how we practiced medicine 5 years ago, read a textbook. If you want to know how we practiced medicine 2 years ago, read a journal. If you want to know how we practice medicine now, go to a good conference. And if you want to know how we will practice medicine in the future, listen in the hallways and use FOAM. And that's because this is kind of medics curating content for themselves on the front line, talking about what they found useful and what hasn't worked, but kind of free from the boundaries of peer review and free from the boundaries of the very rigorous box defined by publishers. And just because it's not in that box doesn't mean it's any less reliable. So a lot of medics are turning to things like this to disseminate information, to find out more information. So in summary, the clinical importance of medical research and accessing articles has a secondary feature because it impacts on patient care and clinical care. I think that all the stakeholders involved should try and engage to find solutions to these problems which are affecting junior researchers, such as the information overload. How do we assess the quality of the content? How can we deal with the open access problem? And how can we measure the individual impact of authors? And finally, I think that, in my opinion, publishers should look to embrace mobile solutions alongside other Web 2.0 technologies and to improve content and to improve interaction and engagement. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll have questions after.
Thanks, Tom, for all of those ideas and suggestions. Please, as before, gather your questions. Don't forget them. Save them. We will have time at the end for plenty of questions, and we should make use of this opportunity. Okay, our final speaker this morning is Janine Swail. Janine is a lecturer in innovation and entrepreneurship at Nottingham University's Business School. Janine, you'll talk about your research interests, so I think I'll leave it there. I just wanted to say a particular thank you to Janine because she joined this at very late notice. I think we spoke last Monday. I can't remember exactly when it was, but I was struggling to find the social science angle, and I know that's a broad area, as are all the others, but Janine stepped into the breach and has been at a conference, I think, until last night, so has done a nice thing by coming along and talking to us as well. So this is the final talk, and then we'll take questions from you all, and from Twitter if there are some on there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. Good morning, everyone. As Bernie said, my name's Janine Swail. I'm a lecturer in innovation and entrepreneurship at Nottingham University. I recently just joined Nottingham in February, and prior to that, I was at Newcastle University. I'm not too sure if I still fall into the early career researcher because I've been lecturing for nearly 6 years now. I graduated with my PhD in 2007 in gender and entrepreneurship, and was very lucky to actually jump straight into a lecturing position as opposed to a research associate or a postdoc. So I've had quite a broad experience of lecturing and research, and also as an associate editor for a journal. So whenever Bernie asked me to come and speak today, I thought, gosh, what could I possibly tell this group of people, you know? And I find myself really thinking, how do I engage with publishers on a day-to-day basis? So I thought, well, perhaps one way I could speak to you this morning is from 3 different perspectives. That is of a researcher, so a day-to-day basis, at least we like to think in a role of a lecturer, you split your time between researching, teaching and working with your students and, you know, your administration and the courses that you're responsible for and that you run. So equally into thirds. So I thought it would be useful to talk to you guys today about what I do as a researcher, as a teacher, so in how I engage with my students, both undergrad, masters, MBAs, exec MBAs and PhD students, and how I encourage them to do research and to engage with journals, with books, with up-to-date information. And then finally, I'll give a little bit of an insight into my experience as an associate editor for a journal, an entrepreneurship journal, and how I engaged again with Emerald, the publishers, and how I felt what worked, what didn't work, etc. So I really hope that out of something I'm going to say that something clicks and something engages your interest and attention. So in terms of a researcher, for those of you who don't know, this beautiful statue here is Athena, the goddess of wisdom. I've just spent 12 days in Greece there last month, and I visited Athens, and I was completely taken with all the Greek gods that exist. So I thought, great, I'm coming here today to speak about knowledge and research. I'll download my photograph of Athena. But in terms of a researcher in the social sciences, so my research looks at entrepreneurship, but my focus is on business startups. And essentially, I really look at how individuals, primarily women and students, develop business ideas, innovative business ideas, be that technology, be that a social enterprise, how they grow those ideas and through creative knowledge, etc., and then commercialize them and start their businesses. I also look at how a business grows through moving into international markets and exports, etc., and different strategies. I teach in those areas as well. And in terms of my other projects, I look at how, for example, a paper that was published recently there looked at students' entrepreneurial intentions when they watch programs like The Dragon's Den and The Apprentice, and the effect that is having on the way they view what it means to be an entrepreneur in society, and the characteristics that they should assume as a result. So that's kind of a flavour of my research area. So in terms of, why did I join academia, okay? My father thinks I wanted to be an eternal student. That's why he says, you went on and did a PhD, And, my mother can't understand that when the summer comes, why I don't get the 2 months off and come back to Ireland, And I say, well, Mum, during those 2 months, I have to be really focusing on my research, I can't just, come back across the water and have a jolly. So in terms of what my commitment is on my day-to-day basis, I'm committed to contributing to the theoretical and practical development of my field, okay? At the end of the day, we're accused for sitting in our ivory towers and theorizing and not communicating that. In my field, that's slightly different. You have to be able to demonstrate how your theory applies in the real world, particularly when you are teaching MBAs and exec MBA students who are out there in industry. If they can't see how your theory is applied or what you're trying to tell them is applied, you're onto a losing streak from the outset. And what does that? How does that implicate, the research and publishing world, etc.? It's trying to get students to engage with databases, with research databases. Try and get them to read journals for a start. It's becoming increasingly difficult, and I'll talk a little bit later about that under teaching. What I'm probably going to go on and talk about within this researcher side is, it's probably going to sound quite egotistical from my perspective, okay? But I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavour of how we have to compete in our own market. So how do I get promoted? How do I develop and develop myself as an academic in the field and move on to the best institutions? So the broader aim is, yes, of course, you contribute to your theoretical and practical development of your field, but you also have to develop credibility, okay? And the only way to do that and to advance in academia is through publishing, okay? So I'm very well aware and was very well aware from early on when I first started my PhD that publishing would be critical for the success of my career. And essentially I would define it, it's an academic's route into the market, okay? So what does that mean? Mostly journal papers are our currency, and you're probably all familiar with the phrase, when you speak to academics, you either publish or you perish, okay? So that's me being brutally honest, and the honesty will continue. Again, I'm sure you are aware of this ref period that is now just about coming to an end, okay? I am no fan of the ref, and I will say that quite openly, and I hope to God the next ref, or whatever it's going to be, is going to be something more dynamic and engaging and allows us to pursue research for doing good research, as opposed to having to get your papers into the top journals, because essentially that's what we have to do, okay? As I say, we're just coming to the end of this ref period, and the Research Excellence Framework is what it actually stands for. And what it means is basically, as an academic, you are required to publish at a certain level and to have a certain amount of points in order for you to be submitted into the Research Excellence Framework. I apologise if I'm sort of telling you something you all already know, but I just want to give you a bit of background on how that implicates publishers. So if you, for example, Nottingham University Business School is a pretty good business school in the country, well, as far as I'm aware. So they would have quite a high calibre of researchers who would publish extensively in their particular fields at quite a high level. And what do I mean by a high level? Well, basically, within social sciences, within business schools, within business and management research, a lot of the top business schools within the UK would look at what's called the Association of Business School list. I think that's recently been changed to the International Guide to Academic Journal Quality, okay? And essentially this list, and it's like it or not, but unfortunately, in the last few years, I have used this list. It's been pinned up on my notice board because I make sure that whenever I write something, and if I feel that it's a good quality paper or it's emerging to something that is of good quality, I will target the top journals first, and then I'll get probably a desktop reject, and then I'll target a lower journal, and gradually. So in my field, I just wanted to give you an insight into how we rate particular journals. So Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice is probably the top focused entrepreneurship journal in my field, and Wiley is the publishers there. It's a North American journal actually, and it would be rated 4 stars. So that would be that would be one of the first journals that I would actually target or seek to publish in. ISBJ then, International Small Business Journal, is a SAGE journal. It's predominantly it's a UK, although it attracts international research, but it's run out of the UK, and it's a good solid 3-star. And again, 4 and 3 stars are very good in terms of if I can publish in 4s and 3s, then I'm doing well. 2-star then, the International Journal of Entrepreneurial Behaviour and Research is an Emerald journal, and this was actually the journal that I was associate editor for 2 years. I gave up the post just about 6 months ago, and I'll tell you a little bit why I did that. And then finally then your 1-star journals is your Journal of International Entrepreneurship. So this is just to give you an idea of how these journals are rated. And interestingly, 3 people have written this ABS list, okay? So there are 3 people who are PVCs and head of schools of business schools, and they have essentially taken a combination of impact factors of how these journals would be rated internationally, and they have graded the journal, okay? So it's quite ruthless, but unfortunately it's something that I've had to follow and had to adhere to. So I have an academic mentor, okay, and she's wonderful, and but she at the same time says, Janine, academia it's a game as well, so you have to play the right game, okay. So what does that mean? Well, I was explicitly told in this ref period, I suppose at the beginning of the ref, I was still an early career researcher. Don't be writing books or book chapters. If anyone asks you to write a book chapter, if a publisher comes to you, knocks on your door and says, we would love you to write a book, would you like to develop a book? You say, no, thank you. It's not a priority, okay? And I don't want anyone thinking, I don't want to be overly negative here today, but I thought I'd better off give you the honest, insight into how I'm being advised as a more junior academic. But books are not my focus as a junior academic. I write my books when I'm at a prof level, when I'm established in my field, when I have plenty of time on my hands, when I have 6 or 7 PhD students who are publishing for me, and that's when I focus on making my book contribution to the field, okay? Non-rated journals, and this is a really tough one, but again, and particularly in my previous institution, don't waste your time submitting to journals that aren't rated, okay? It's not worth it. And you can see how absolutely detrimental that is to a journal that's just starting out, okay? One journal that I can think of in particular is, it's a journal in my field, the International Journal of Gender and Entrepreneurship, and I think it's an Emerald journal. And I review for that journal only because the editor I know quite well, and she's really doing her best to develop the journal and to try and get good people to write and good people to review for the journal. And I've recently guest edited a special issue in that journal, and it was tough because the quality of the papers weren't good, and you're doing your best to try and get those papers up to the right quality so that they can be published. But equally so, my mentor would tell me she wasn't happy when I told her that I was doing this special issue, but my commitment is, well, this is my field, this is gender and entrepreneurship, we have to get our research out there. It's not rated as it is in the mainstream business schools, so a new journal with a particular focus is really important. But again, there's a lot of of my colleagues who would never consider to submit to a non-rated journal. And again, in terms of how we review and how we, as opposed to just doing our own research, we are encouraged to only edit again for the top journals. So if you get invited by the editor of ETP, Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, to do a review, you do that. Unfortunately, the lower rated journals, if I get invited to review for a lower rated journal, I'll look at how my diary's filling up for the next couple of weeks before I commit, okay? So that's kind of, again, it sounds very ruthless, very strategic, but it is about playing the right game as an academic. I want to say a little bit about open access, and Tom talked a little bit about that, and he's certainly more well-versed than I am, but because essentially, I don't want to say too much because you'll quickly find out that I don't know very much, but I suppose it's even that in itself is maybe useful to communicate because, you know, open access, what is it? It's an obscure alternative for publishing research, in my mind, in my world anyway, okay? You know, I do see how in the long term, yes, of course, it's a positive step for sharing and being able to disseminate our research. And I think once we all understand what it is, once we all communicate together and have a plan in place to how we can actually operationalize this notion of open access properly across all disciplines and institutions, then yes, it will certainly be really positive. And that would be my argument. You know, we do need, I would seek as an academic a little bit more clarity, okay? All universities do have a policy on open access because before I came here today, I did jump on to the Nottingham University website and say, well, you know, what is their policy? But that's all well and good, but listening to Tom and in his field, you know, open access is essential for what he has to do on a day-to-day basis. But I would argue that open access for me raises other issues about where you put your work before it's published. Because again, there are some journals who would definitely discourage you to putting your work online anywhere before it is published in that journal. And again, whether it was the right advice or the wrong advice, but I have just played a safer game and said, well, no, I'm not putting anything that's not published onto an open access website for other people to view. So be that a working paper, I probably would err caution in doing that. Yeah, that's where I feel at the minute. In the short term, open access, it's an academic quagmire. You know, everyone has different opinions and how it should work and how it doesn't work, etc. So we would do well to get this cleared up and sorted out as a group together. Again, yeah, I've said it already. You know, I would be reluctant to publish outside of recognised arenas, and this notion of the gold and the green, I read a couple of papers online about this. Ultimately, somebody will have to pay. So whether that be the individual end user, as Tom said, in terms of paying your $30 and getting the article that you want. I know that I am constantly working, particularly at this time of the year, with my librarians who are excellent, but you know, asking them, you know, can you clarify for me which journals we have, which journals we don't have? How can we get access to these journals for the start of the term? Bless them, they're turning around and saying to me, we can't, Janine, now, you know, I have to put it on a list, it has to be prioritised. I have to lobby for journals that I want in order for my students to be able to download it. Yes, there are some of my colleagues who use SSRN and ePrints, but again, I myself haven't set myself up on SSRN, and that's maybe just because I'm a little bit cautious. I was listening to Tom going, gosh, I'm a complete technophobe in comparison to Tom, so and maybe that's because I'm not of the generation Y, I'm just a year underneath that, so you know, that's my excuse anyway. So moving on then, in terms of as a teacher then, as a lecturer, yeah, we're starting term now in the next couple of weeks, and I'm responsible for an MSc course in entrepreneurship, and I will have a lot of keen students knocking on my door and asking what I should read and what I should, you know, what textbook do I need, you know, how do I go about my course of study. I suppose this is with particular respect to entrepreneurship, and those of you that maybe have engaged with business schools and the entrepreneurship discipline, you might be aware of this, but the textbook approach when teaching entrepreneurship isn't always conducive, okay? And therefore, I don't have an assigned textbook for any of my modules that I teach, okay? There's a couple of reasons for that. A, I use a whole variety of teaching methods. And B, I think our students are paying enough for their education now, particularly if they're studying at the best universities. So I'm very reluctant at the start of a module to say, oh, by the way, you need 40 quid because you need to buy this textbook, okay? And I'm not a big advocate. When I teach, I don't follow a week-by-week chapter of a textbook. I say to students, consult this book, consult this journal, come back and tell me what you think. So, I much more encourage independent learning, and I guide my students to various forums and journals and papers and books, etc. What you also have to think about with entrepreneurship is in terms of our teaching tools. We will use a range of different teaching tools, and what's becoming increasingly more popular in my field is business simulation games, business game simulations. So you may or may not have heard of SimVenture, which is basically a simulation game that students use across a module in particular that I teach on. And it's a practical simulation game where they have to run a business, okay? And it's really quite effective. And again, being the technophobe, I kind of look at them when I'm doing going around the classroom, the computer classrooms, and go, oh yeah, you're doing very well there, and I don't have a clue what they've done, but at the end of the day, if there's a little smiley face at the bottom right-hand corner, and if that guy's happy, then that means they're doing well. If that guy's sad, you essentially have to go, well, look at your balance sheet, it's rubbish, or look at your turnover, so I normally get to the bottom of it, but I wouldn't be able to tell them exactly what buttons to press. Also in my teaching, I use role models and guest speakers, so effectively that's much more, students respond much better to that than getting them to read the journals and the articles and the textbooks, etc. So we video record some of our guest speakers as well, and we upload them onto our Moodle and our Blackboard, etc. So we are becoming more innovative in terms of how we teach our students. In terms of I'll just skip on because I did, yes. In terms of where I said I talk a little, I use journals and papers, particularly with master's students and MBA students. I do think, if you're at master's level, you do have to know about the research and you have to be able to download the journals, but it's very surprising the amount of master's students who don't even know how to go through their library website to download a journal, okay? And what I normally do at the beginning of term is I actually take students through, okay, when you need to find this journal, this is how you do it, okay? And because 9 times out of 10, most of the students, particularly undergrads, won't know how to do that. And the only time they really engage with journal databases is maybe when they're doing a dissertation in their final year or something like that. So I think that's something that you might want to keep in mind. It's becoming increasingly more difficult, and I'll talk a little bit more about the average student that I deal with. I do want to say a little bit about the journal embargo, because that does impact me as a teacher. I said a little bit about working with librarians to try and get my journals in place. Very often there might be a paper that is just published in the last few months, and I'm updating my lecture slides, or I'm preparing to write a literature review for a paper. It has to be up to date, it has to be current. I find the paper, I'm able to view the abstract. I say, great, this is something that I'm going to put into my literature review. And I click on the download and I see this. And Bernie put up a similar slide. But, the words that I don't want to see are, sorry, you do not have access to this article. Okay, that really frustrates me because I'm prepared to read the paper there and then, but I can't get it. So I email my librarian. I say, can you tell me what the embargo is on this particular journal? And she says 18 months. And I said, well, that's of absolutely no use to me because that paper is going to be published in 18 months. So what do I do then? I email the author, and I send them a lovely email and say, I'm really interested in your paper, but unfortunately it's not available in this particular format as yet. Could you send me the most recent PDF copy? And of course they send it to you, and therefore as a result I don't pay my £70 or my £23 for the one-off, and like it or not, if somebody else asks me for the paper, I will email them the PDF. And of course I'll say, make sure you cite the journal and you know, the proper reference when and if. But that's kind of the reality of how these embargoes are not really helping. And I understand, you know, at a broader level, it's expenses. Universities have certain budgets, business schools have budgets, so it's not ideal, of course. Just a few little words then in terms of the average student, okay? And I've talked a little bit about this, so I won't dwell too much on it. As I said, most undergrad students don't know how to or just won't use the journal databases, okay? They may do so whenever they realise the importance of it is for their literature review for a dissertation, etc. So the likes of ABI Inform, Scopus, Science Direct, they would be the main databases that I would direct my students to and that I would use myself. Yes, I would say at best a good student will go through Google Scholar. I go through Google Scholar as well sometimes, because often to get onto these databases I have to be either in my office, in the university campus, or then I have to go onto the library website. I know I can put them on my favourites, but again, I'm technophobe. I don't do that. But so it takes me a few more clicks to get to the databases. So I'll be honest, Google Scholar, it's not a half bad tool, and I know that my students do use that. At worst, Wikipedia, okay? I do make a point of saying, if I see any Wikipedia references, you lose marks or whatever, so I try to discourage students from using that. And what I would say is, yes, students want to get to the paper, to the article in as few clicks as possible. They are the digital natives. They want information there and now, not yesterday. Finally, then, I just want to say a few words about my role as an associate editor. My role was with the International Journal of Entrepreneurial Behaviour and Research. I was the associate editor there for nearly 2 years. Why did I do it? Well, essentially, it's back to this notion of developing reputation. If you're a journal editor, it's a prestige indicator, okay? And whilst I received a stipend for doing that, it wasn't much. You know, it's essentially it's pro bono, okay? You use your Saturday mornings, maybe once every other week. You get through your papers, a couple of evenings maybe in the week as well. So you put this journal work over, not within the day-to-day basis of your work, okay? I worked with Emerald, and as a team they were excellent. They use a processing database called Scholar One, and what I would argue is that in itself is quite onerous and quite clunky, and I spent many an hour trying to find a paper under where it was in the system. So that's maybe something in terms of processing papers that you might want to keep in mind. The first speaker alluded to the reviewing process, and you know, how do you get academics to review for you? Essentially, you are relying on their goodwill, okay? And now I do know that some journals offer a subscription for maybe 3 or 6 months once they've reviewed a couple of times for journals, and that's a really good incentive. But by and large, it's the rapport that you develop with the academics in your field, and it's even the tone of the email that you write in order to get them to review for me. I know that Scholar One very often, you know, it brings up an automatic email, but by and large I would customize and tailor that email to the reviewer, that if I really wanted them to review the paper, I would make it more bespoke so that, you know, I could see that I was engaging with them directly. So that's something that we might want to consider, because in order to develop these journals, in order to keep these journals on the go, there isn't much incentive either as a reviewer or as an editor. And essentially, that one of the reasons why I ceased the role, again, speaking very strategically here, it was on the CV. I did it for 2 years. I learned an awful lot about the process and about the reviewing process and managing reviews, but it was time consuming, and I gave up the role. It's also a 2-star journal, but it was a really good experience. But that's kind of something you might want to think about. And finally then, just some questions and some points to wrap up. You know, I was quite nervous about coming here today because, you know, I'll be honest, I don't think about you guys in terms of my day-to-day basis, you know, and this has really forced me to think, well, actually, you know, how do we engage? And actually, do I understand publishers and what is my opinion of them? I was about to say that the third point there, you know, oh, sure, they're all just large corporates who need to please their shareholders. And then I read a little bit about this conference, and I understand it's not-for-profit publishers. So I'm glad I didn't go to town on that one. Again, I mean, what are my incentives for engaging with this community over and above the day-to-day basis of what my job is about? Okay. Some questions I would ask, you know, this next ref period, as academics, we're quite uncertain of what that's going to look like. And I would really like to hear from ideas from how maybe the publishing sector can influence how this ref is managed and what it actually transpires to be. And then, again, just to reiterate there in terms of open access, I think we all need greater clarity on how that's going to affect us all in the future. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so thank you very much, Janine. I found all 3 talks fascinating, and I'm a bit anxious that I couldn't tweet because I'm sitting up here. It's not my usual behaviour. We've got 2. We started 5 minutes late, so if people, I'm looking at some ALPS people here. If you're happy for us to run over, so that we'll have 7 minutes then for questions. So. Hands up. Has anybody got a question they'd like to ask any of our speakers? Okay. I can't see who has microphones. Oh, there's one coming. There's one coming to you. If you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Hi there. Mark Moreau from Emerald Group Publishing. Myself and Janine are actually colleagues. So, when your involvement with IJEBR, when I was actually the publisher of that portfolio, what's interesting to hear you say is that you rescinded the role because it became very time-consuming. I wonder, would your decision have been otherwise if IJEBR was a 3 or 4-star journal? Because, to the best of my knowledge, the 3 and 4-star journals all use the same systems, so they come from within the same publishing scholarly communication industry. How much of a motivation was the fact that it was a 2 rather than a 3 or 4-star journal?
I would say, because of the particular point I was at in my career. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. I would say my choice to review at that stage was basically just to get the experience of the review process. So I would have. Whilst yes, I probably would have thought twice about giving up if it was a 3 or a 4. I fully recognise that at this stage of my career, I wouldn't be an associate editor, certainly not of a 4-star, and I don't even think at the minute I would be. Maybe I might be ready for a 3-star at the minute. So at that stage, I was more looking at that as just an opportunity to get experience with a. I mean. Algebra, I'm not just saying this, but it's a good little journal, and we did get good papers. So at that stage, I wouldn't have been as concerned. However, if I tweak your question slightly now, if someone was to ask me to become involved with a journal again, I would say that I would probably only look to review maybe at the 3-star level again, because in my mind, I've been there, I've done it, I've got the T-shirt, and I would want to progress it and build on that experience. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Okay, there's a question over here.
Hi, Peter Richardson from The Bone and Joint Journal. Snappy title. I just wanted to ask, I think a couple of you certainly talked about the process of submitting a paper, you try the top-rated journal first, and then one, further down the line. I think, Sabina, you particularly mentioned this. Could I just ask you, and perhaps the others, what your views are, if you've had any experience of cascade journals, where an article may be rejected by, perhaps a fairly high-ranking journal, but you are offered an alternative to sort of carry that paper with its peer reviews across to another journal, generally an open access journal. Have any of you had any experience of Cascade journals, and if so, do you have any views on them?
I haven't had any experience of that, but I would definitely give it consideration. I think I'd have to know a bit more about the kind of suggested journal it went to and how it fitted with the timing in the project. So if it was something I was quite eager to get out soon, I might go for that option rather than trying myself somewhere else.
Similar to Sabine, I've not actually had direct access trying that out, but I have, when I've looked, I find that certainly with the medical journals that they're very, very specific in what kind of article they want, because there's so many different, I'm sure you understand that as a BJJ editor, that you basically structure your article for a journal, and then if it doesn't go in there, you actually almost have to rewrite it completely to go somewhere else. And so I'm thinking of the articles that I've written submitted to places that do take Cascade, and I've rejected that on the basis that I know that the next guy who looked at it wouldn't find it appropriate because it's not written in the style that they would want.
And again, I'm afraid I've no experience of working with Cascade journals at all. It would, what I alluded to in the presentation, I would obviously aim first and probably cascade myself, you know.
Question at the front here.
John Hudson from English Heritage Publishing. As a book publisher, I'm aware of the lower status of books in the ref process, so you haven't spoilt my morning entirely. And actually, we have published a few books this year which are ref related, so clearly there's a little bit of influence there. Yeah. But I was under the impression that under the current ref round, impact and influence in towards a slightly more general audience has some kind of scoring, and therefore the prestige, if you like, of books or book chapters was slightly different from previous procedures. And I wondered if all the previous rounds of ref and its predecessors, and I wonder if the panel or other members of the audience could explain a bit more about that.
Well, yes, impact certainly has been another buzzword. And again, there wasn't much clarity in this current ref period how, as institutions, we make our research impactful. Often what you found was academics conducted an impact case study and made sure that, you know, they got their work out there. Again, I mean, I suppose I'm just giving my opinion. I did have a colleague that did submit a book chapter to a good book, an edited book, and she was quite excited about it at the time. It was HR, human resource management related, and she thought that it would be included in her ref. And when this was about a year ago, when institutions are constantly keeping an eye on where we are in terms of the ref, she presented this book chapter as one of her ref submissions, and they didn't take it. So she was quite. She thought, but it's an impact ref. It should, it's got a great case. It tells a great story, and they felt no. So again, impact. I think in the next ref, though, we're becoming more clear about how impact is becoming more important. But again, I mean, I suppose that's only from my experience. So I don't know whether that answers the question or not.
It's a bit different in medical terms, because all the clinicians, whether you're an academic or not, whenever you publish, like, you're not graded on the ref as such unless you are actually an academic. We are graded by, if you want to apply for a competitive specialty, then you need to have a publication, a first author publication in a leading journal, and that's kind of what we would go off rather than a ref as such. And in terms of applying to me directly, because I'm not a PhD student, I'm just an undergrad essentially, we don't really filter or fit in with the ref kind of guidance. We don't have formal supervisors and so on, so it is a bit different in medicine, because every clinician is expected to try and publish a little bit, whether or not they're academic or not, and the ones who are academic are supposed to be kind of looking and going into the top journals, trying to actually advance the knowledge. So I kind of circumvented your question there, but sorry.
Can we take one more? Or, yep. Okay, there's a hand up at the back there in the corner. Oh.
2 questions.
We'll squeeze 2 in if they're very quick. I feel compelled to give you a bit more time with the researchers.
Quick comment. My name is Kave from River Valley. I think that ideas put up by the students, these are exactly what the publishers should be listening to. A lot of what's going on in publishing, the procedures are really outdated by years, sometimes decades. And one of the things is Sabina who mentioned the having an online tool for authoring rather than the antiquated method of writing in a word processor and attaching it and then paying someone, actually us, we are typesetters, paying us to then structure that again. It doesn't make sense. So I'm very much in favor of an online writing tool, a collaborative writing tool. The only thing I'd say, you don't want a publisher to have that, because if you write it online and then submit it to that publisher, if it's not accepted, you want to take that content and take it elsewhere. So I'd say various third parties should have this online tool, and then you can take your content, press a button, go to this, go to the other.
Okay.
Just a quick response to that. One of the, I completely agree with you, and I think it's a really good point. And just for people who may not know, the Cochrane collaboration have their own, which is a medical journal organisation. They have what they've developed, and it's kind of specific to them. They call it Archie, and that's what you're talking about there. You write your article in Archie, if you like, and then you kind of sign it out and sign it in. So it's not quite collaborative yet, but you can access it from anywhere, and it's kind of along the lines of what you're talking about. But the problem that they have is, as you rightly pointed out, that it's only used for writing Cochrane reviews. So it's only specific to that journal, but it is a step in the right direction, I think.
Okay, one last question. Oh, got the mic here.
I'm Catherine Spiller from Bioscientifica. I wanted to ask all of you, if you could choose how to be judged and how to progress, how would you want to be judged? On the amount you publish, on citations, on your peers' views of your work? How?
That's a really good question. Sometimes I feel, because you're so conditioned into a way of thinking, that when someone asks that question, it's like, gosh, what am I doing as an academic? Why am I here? I think for me, a big because I research gender and entrepreneurship. It's about how women set up their businesses and how they, they challenge the structure and the agency, the environment that they're in. So whenever I do my research, if I always judge myself particularly when a woman who maybe a nascent female entrepreneur, so someone who wants to set up their business, asks me, so what do you actually do in your research? If I can't communicate to them what my research is really about and how it impacts on them and how it's important for them, then that's when I would question why I get up every day. So that sounds very great and good and whatever, but I think I apply that with my students as well. I enjoy it whenever students do actually come back to me and say, oh, I read that article and, I have some questions about that. So it's about being able to communicate your research to not just other academics. It's quite depressing when you think if you get a paper published, what's the average number of people that are going to read it? I don't allow myself to even think, because, I think about the hours and the days and the months that I spent working up a paper that maybe only a dozen people would read at the end of the day. So it's about communicating that and making people understand that your life's not a holiday,
I would say that as a PhD student, I guess peer endorsement is quite important to me. But looking to the future, if I was to work as an academic and I taught as well as did research, then I think exercises such as the REF should take into consideration both the quality of the research but also the quality of the teaching, and that seems to me from where I am that's absent, because there's you can tell that sometimes certain people prefer research to teaching, and perhaps they're not as open to engaging with their students, and that's a kind of a key bit that's been overlooked.
So to add my thoughts on how would I like to be measured impact, I'm a bit of a techie, if you like. I quite enjoy, things like using algorithms to try and solve problems. So I would argue that something along similar lines to what Google did when they first started out how to revolutionise web searching. So take into account factors that we currently do, like citations, impact factor, the H-index if it's relevant, and then add into things some of the alt metrics that you talk about, things like tweets. See what people talk about at conferences, because that's currently not really valued at all. If you give presentations at conferences, it's not really measured unless apart from peer to peer. And then I would like to see that all kind of combined together to spit out a number, which I wouldn't even know where to begin to start, but that would be a way to try and measure it. But one thing that I think really needs to change is, particularly in the field that I work in, which is, only started as a new field in 2007. It never even existed really before then. There's only a handful of people even working in it, and there's only a handful of publications that come out each year. So that's never going to match or have the same level, be able to compete with somebody who's doing research into, say, cancer or smoking, because there's thousands of articles being published on that. So the only way at the moment that you can keep track of what's good is if you know the industry, and I'd like to see some metric developed somehow or somewhere which could at least equalise across that.
Thanks. Okay, I think we need to draw to a close. Can you please give our speakers another hand? I think that was really, really useful for all of us.